Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Gary Shteyngart, the acclaimed author of Super Sad True Love Story and Lake Success, is back with Vera or Faith. Set in a near-future America wrestling with authoritarian politics and cultural anxiety, the story is told through the eyes of 10-year-old Vera, a sharp, observant child navigating a fractured family and a society teetering on the edge. Half Russian, half Korean, Vera grapples with questions of identity, belonging, and love, all while confronting a country proposing a 5/3 amendment designed to privilege white voters. With his trademark wit and offbeat charm, Shteyngart turns what could be a bleak dystopia into something deeply human, funny, sad, and, yes, hopeful. Gary Shteyngart's debut novel was The Russian Debutante's Handbook, which won the National Jewish Book Award for fiction. Other novels include Absurdistan, Super Sad True Love Story, and Our Country Friends. Again, the new novel is Vera or Faith, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Gary Shteyngarт back to this week's book show. Gary, thank you very much for being with us.
Great to be back. Thank you.
What brought you to this particular place of wanting to write a smaller story and a book that is very focused and a lot of fun?
Thank you. Well, first of all, let's start with the fun. I try to be fun in everything I write because I think there's a kind of social contract between reader and writer where for a little while they get to enter another consciousness and also maybe enjoy themselves a little bit. And so every book I've written has a little bit of that social compact. My previous book obviously was set in this neck of the woods, upstate New York.
Right.
And but with this book, I wanted to focus on the consciousness of a 10-year-old child, because obviously that is something I've never written about. All my novels have been from a very adult standpoint. So to delve into a younger, but still very inquisitive and in her own way, very funny mind is what I wanted to do.
When did Vera come to you?
I think it was during a very long plane ride from Tokyo to New York. I was rewatching Kramer versus Kramer, which is, for those of us who are a little bit older, that is a story about a divorce, famous, I think it was 1980 or something around
Yes.
there, with the wonderful Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep as this divorce or about to be divorced couple. But there was a kid in there, Billy, I think his name was. And I was thinking, wow, when does Billy get to tell his story? Because he was more like a pawn between those two. And so that's kind of the origin of that. Of course, there are other stories about divorces set from the points of view of children. Henry James's What Maisie Knew being a good one, also a movie. So yeah, it was quite exceptional to think about changing things around so that it wasn't just the parents who got to air their grievances, but the poor kid stuck in the middle.
Let me just read the first line of the novel. School started and it was awful, predictably awful, as Ann Mom would say. A self-fulfilling prophecy, she might add, of Vera's disdain for school. That use of quotes from other people, that continues throughout the novel beautifully. And it's an interesting device, for want of a better word, to bring this character very much to life and sort of give us her understanding of what's happening as she deals with an adult world.
When I was growing up, it was interesting because I was always listening to what my parents were saying, always trying to figure out what they meant. In my case, there was a bit of a hiccup there because we had moved to America from the Soviet Union at a certain point. So I was listening and getting quotes in Russian while also trying to listen and pick up things in English. But for me, even when I think back to my childhood, it was all the words that they used, often very sophisticated words that still stuck to me. They were always fighting, just like the parents in this book, and I was always trying to be the diplomat and try to keep them together, which is something Vera is also doing. So I think she is using her list of words that she has to know as a way of picking up and trying to understand the sophistication with which their parents are waging war against each other.
So they're dealing with words like fugue and trying to figure exactly what that
Right.
state
Yeah. Yeah.
is.
Daddy's in a fugue. What is a fugue? So she's constantly, and obviously, being a kid today, she's able to very quickly look things up and see what they mean on the computer.
You talked about the parents always fighting. And that's a tough thing for a kid, and yet this is a tough kid who has a really interesting view on life.
Yeah, I think, when writing about kids, I don't like the idea of precociousness. That's one thing that I sort of flee from. But what interests me more is anxiety and the way that that anxiety is both fed by it and also, in a sense, is explained by it. So that you're trying to draw your own roadmap out of a very confusing situation. But sometimes the fact that you are able to understand things better than other kids your age puts you in the place where the confusion mounts. So it's good and bad to be super smart. On the other hand, I think as the child grows up, they are able to understand the world in a much more complete way than kids that have to fumble for things. Most writers I know, most artists I know did not exactly have happy childhoods for whatever reason. It doesn't always have to lead to their parents, although it would in Vera's case. But yeah, I think there's a lot of complexity to these kids who both feed off their anxiety and try to figure out a way out of the cage of anxiety.
And how much do you think the parents understand the child's anxiety? Because it appears not much.
Not much, because I think what happens, and this is really what Henry James was writing about, and in some ways it's also what Kramer versus Kramer is, although Kramer versus Kramer is sort of a pitched fight between these two. But I think the idea is that in the process of when a family disintegrates, everybody is looking out for themselves in the middle of a kind of war of attrition. And the child, in this case, children, because Vera does have a brother,
Yes.
the children are the ones left to sort of pick up the pieces. It's the worst place to be. In a loving family, the child is supported by two parents, but in a family undergoing this kind of fight, nobody's being supported. The combatants are mostly looking out for themselves. That said, I should say that the fights that they have are pretty funny. They're both very witty people, the two combatants here, the two people getting divorced. So Vera does get to have fun picking up all these choice phrases that she then has to reinterpret.
You mentioned Henry James a moment ago. There is a nod here to what Maisie knew. Give us a sense of your connection to that book and how it played into this.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my favorite of James's books, but I thought that that was an incredible thing to do because I think writing about divorce at that stage in history, I mean, nowadays divorce, most marriages I think end in divorce, or at least half of them do. So, but this idea of writing about it, both the innocence of the child's point of view and the kind of awfulness of the parents involved. It's interesting how many lives throughout history have been lived out in this particular model, but yet it took James to really put it down on paper in a way that really resonated. I mean, I think he, in some ways, gave us the literary concept of divorce or the literary treatment of divorce as seen from a child's point of view. There's been nothing like it since. I do mean it. When I was watching Kramer versus Kramer, I was thinking, this is such a great book and such a great movie. And at the same time, like, if you could just extend it for 40 minutes and give us like an appendix with, or I don't know, an epilogue with Billy. Billy's 10 years older now, and he's going to the University of Chicago, and he's reflecting on what his parents had put him through when he was a kid. Right. This is my attempt to square that. This is Billy's epilogue as seen from a 10-year-old girl's point of view.
Then 10 years later, Billy's in therapy. What's going on there?
I would hope Billy's already in therapy. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing too is and I alluded to it as I was reading just that first line, but there's Ann Mom, ANNE mom, and then mom, and that plays very much into the differentiation of these two characters to Vera.
Yeah, I think that so mom is her biological mom who she doesn't know what happened to her. And part of the book is her exploration of trying to figure out what had happened there. And Ann Mom is her adoptive mom. Now, Mom is Korean American and Ann Mom is kind of blue blood Boston Brahmin. So part of it is that she's trying to figure out her identity, but also part of that is I mean, it's her identity, but it's also in part her racial identity that she's trying to square because obviously the rest of the family doesn't look like her. So the book becomes toward the end of it, the book becomes a kind of road picaresque tale. Well, as picaresque as From New York to Ohio gets, but there's definitely that element of it, as because her original mom hailed from the great state of Ohio.
There's that point, and you do have to tell yourself every once in a while, but it is it's true. This is a character who is only 10 years old, and yet has so much on their plate and dealing with so much, as I guess so many kids do, even at 10 years old.
Well, and here's the thing, like, the book is set in a near future with a even slightly more dystopian America, if you can believe it. And even despite all the terrible things happening to her, there are children all over the world who still lack any of the privilege or many of the privileges that she has. She's not yet worried about drinking water and other kinds of safety. So, but that doesn't mean that she doesn't have a lot on her plate. And I think a lot of the book also draws tension, not just from the fight between her parents, but from the fact that she lives in a society that no longer knows what it's there for, that no longer has a governing mission. Things are falling apart on both a private level and a kind of public level. And she has to sort of pick up the pieces of both of these collapses.
When you started to write about Vera, did she become very was she very defined at the beginning, or did that come over time?
I wrote this in a crazy huff of 51 days, but I think I spent 2 months thinking about it or so. I had going back to that time in my own mind, but obviously putting it into a character living today or today plus a couple of years. And also switching gender was I think good. I think it gave a more kind of an emotional resonance than some of than she would have if she was a boy at that age because of the way boys and girls mature, the quickness or
Mm-hmm.
slowness.
Gary Shteyngart is our guest. The name of the new book is Vera or Faith, and it is published by Random House. Talk about Vera's father, and this is a writer. He is a magazine editor for a New Yorker type magazine, right?
Well, I think he wants to compete with the New Yorker. The New Yorker is what he desperately wants to, be, but can't quite get there. So, he is. We were talking about how Henry James and all the other characters, for example, back to Kramer versus Kramer, how the Dustin Hoffman character Kramer is this very self-absorbed ad executive who can only think about his job, and the child is really very much peripheral to his life, as is his wife, and the very same can be said for Vera's dad. But at the same time, she really looks up to her dad, really respects him. She thinks of him as something that she should try to emulate. And I think the reader ends up thinking, please don't emulate this guy, whatever you do.
You seem to while he is defined, that you and maybe I'm wrong on this, but it seems that you made a conscious decision not to write too much about him, that
Yeah.
this was going to stay focused on Vera.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I've written about these kinds of narcissistic male characters. For example, my novel Lake Success featured a very self-involved hedge fund manager. I mean, while this guy has his own specific issues, I did want to focus very much on Vera. This is very much her story. He is one of the obstacles that were one of the chess pieces she's trying to move around in her mind to make her life better, to solve this challenge, this game that she's playing. But at the same time, um, it's among all these characters, hers is the point of view to which I'm mostly drawn. And it's a third person book, but it very much hovers around her throughout the book.
You mentioned the game and the pieces, but one of her closest companions is this chess simulator. It's named Kaspi, after Garry Kasparov, of course, the Russian chess genius. And Kaspi is cool because it's like playing with Siri or Google Home, right? Although with a bit more feeling in what Kaspi, the advice and the thoughts that Kaspi dispenses to Vera.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the family structure, but I think an even more omnipresent focus for Vera is her attempt to make a friend. She has never made a friend in her life. And her attempt to make a friend is really kind of the driving challenge of the book. And no spoilers, but things do happen in that area. Very good things. And Caspi, who is an artificial intelligence, is, I think, her stutter step, her beginning toward of her journey. It's sort of something very interesting because I think a lot of children are going to be growing up with artificial intelligences as maybe their first companions or their first friends. The book obviously set a little bit in the future where they're kind of omnipresent. The car that the family drives, named Stella, is an artificial intelligence who's always trying to butter everyone up and trying to get into their good graces. Caspi is a much more kind of even-keeled persona. He actually helps her out quite a bit. He teaches her things. He's almost, in some ways, we think of him as a friend, but he's also kind of like the parent she almost doesn't have, right? Certainly doesn't have in her father. So there's a lot of onus being put on what this artificial intelligence can do. But the real challenge for her is to make a human friend.
You mentioned this early on, and I just want to go back to it for a second, which is how important language is to Vera, and keeping a list of things that she understands and doesn't understand, which is very interesting as well, that it's almost cataloged. And that's a fascinating aspect to the character.
Yeah, and I think this really takes me back to childhood because I always kept lists of words because I didn't know English. So I was always trying to figure out what everything meant. Now, Vera, of course, lives in America, speaks English, is American born, but she's always trying to figure out what everything means. And there's a political situation that's happening in the country where there's a constitutional convention which wants to give 5/3 of a vote to exceptional Americans, those who
Right.
came during the time of the revolution but didn't come in chains, so meaning mostly white Americans. And Vera is obviously half Korean American by birth. And so she is not going to be a quote unquote exceptional American. So, in a way, she's trying to keep this list of things to figure out both what everything means in her personal life, but also trying to figure out what it means in the world beyond. There's really a lot of stuff she needs to learn. But the question is, how much stuff should a 10-year-old be burdened with learning at that point? It's an interesting question. Sometimes people talk about the childhoods they had themselves, playing stickball out on the streets, staying up till 10 p.m. And now, of course, all of this is gone. We're all buried into our phones, even young people. Childhood now has been very much truncated in some ways and replaced with endless anxiety. And I think that's what Vera is going through. And I think the book sort of the reason she has so many things on her plate, as you were saying before, is because I think in many ways a lot of our children have a lot of things on their plate, and this is sort of both a humorous and and a somewhat sad look at what that combines, what that means.
We didn't mention this, but Vera is a 10-year-old Korean American in this family that is wealthy-ish, right? And in the fifth grade, but as you say, it's anxious to the point of, and you write about this beautifully, of a flapping of her hands. I mean that there's so much energy going on, and anxiousness that it causes her to physically flap her hands.
It's interesting because a lot of readers have been, advanced readers have been writing reviews and saying, is she neurodivergent? Is that part of it? I leave that as a question mark, but I think there's a place where sort of there's a kind of middle ground where diagnoses of anxiety can bleed into some neurodivergent diagnoses. There's a kind of middle ground there. But I think she definitely, like most children, needs a physical outlet for what are too many things being sent her way. So the diary is one way. The diary where she writes down all her words is one way of looking at it, and then this is another way of her expressing itself. Her psychiatrist says that things always come out sideways, and I think that's absolutely true for all of us. When we can't cope, we figure out other ways to cope. Some of them good, and many of them bad.
You spoke about this a moment ago, and I wanted to spend some time on it, and that is the political crisis that is going on within the novel, where states are about to hold a constitutional convention to decide on this amendment that would give an enhanced vote to Americans who landed on the shores of this country before or during the Revolutionary War, but were exceptional enough not to arrive in chains. It's a 5/3 vote. two things about this. I mean, one, of course, is that it doesn't seem all that far-fetched to believe
No,
that
not at all. Not
that
at all.
this could be next year. But
Yeah.
also, the idea that this is a divided. You were writing about a divided America that quite possibly, depending on the outcome of this vote, could become even more divided.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you were saying, there's really no bottom here. I think there's no end of where things can go. And with this book, again, everything's already happening. There's no reason to just focus on what's already happening. But at the same time, the interesting part to me is, as somebody who grew up in a totalitarian, authoritarian country, the Soviet Union, I'm always curious as to how much of that stuff remains with you for the rest of your life. I've written several dystopian books, and I think coming from the Soviet Union is a huge part of that. It's a question. You see, like sometimes I'll hear children talking and they'll mention Trump, for example. And I think that that's something that happens in authoritarian countries. There's no reason a 10-year-old needs to talk about political things. But I think it's been so this is what happens with authoritarian leaders, is that they are so larger than life. They need to be imprinted on every conversation, whether negative or positive. They need to dominate the discourse. And the question is, what does that do to a child growing up? How does a child think about these things? And how do we transition to democracy? What happens, or back to democracy? What happens to children like that? Does the stain of those authoritarian years constantly live with you?
And this is a child who has this all going around them and is looking at the adults in their life and trying to figure that out, but also just worried about the things that kids do worry about getting a C on a quiz. And Vera
Yeah.
perhaps taking it a step further of, oh, okay, but is this going to screw me up getting into Swarthmore?
I mean, Vera goes to a very kind of a gifted and talented school. There's a lot of pressure on her. And I think part of this is this kind of the pressure that we put on kids, because I think the society has become so winner take all that if your kid doesn't get into X, Y, and Z, then it's considered a calamity by some parents. Because I think, we're dealing with all these giant things, the environmental collapse, which is dealing with the rise of AI. We don't know how that's going to impact, the kind of jobs kids are going to get. So there's such a need for children to just win and win and win and constantly win, that it becomes this endless thing, which is terrible. We're talking about all the things that are on Vera's plate, and definitely that's one of them.
You said something earlier. I made a note, and I thought it was interesting because in reading this book, this is such a sweet character and such a sweet girl dealing with so much. And you said you didn't want this character to be precocious, and this character is far from precocious. But I would think that must have been difficult to make sure that she didn't become precocious, because she's advanced, she's got a lot going on, she has a lot of thoughts, she can put things together, and yet you present her as very real.
Thank you. Well, I mean, what I wanted her to be was sensitive and able to think at great length about everything around her, whether emotional, psychological, and yeah, societal. I wanted her to constantly be trying to figure things out, and that needs a kind of innocence. But that also requires, I mean, there are children who are super smart, but they aren't active in sort of probing the whole world around them. They maybe lack that curiosity. But I do think there's just too much emphasis being put on how children are smart at a certain age. There are tests in New York City that you take to get your kid into school when they're 4 years old. I mean, it's like
Right.
we're so interested in everything being gamified and being, ranked and et cetera, that it's like it never ends. And I think that's one reason that I wanted to steer away a little bit from just saying, okay, she's very precocious. It's more like that she is anxious and emotionally open to that anxiety. And that creates interesting characters. I think this book has been resonating with for example, a lot of women readers who kind of connect to Vera because they were Vera when they were younger. Obviously men as well, but there's a certain kind of character. And I think those are the people right now that read books. I think that's the audience for books are people who grew up with a certain sense of maybe a slight sense of social incompetence combined with anxiety. That certainly was me. And I think it's people, and I think Vera captures that kind of dynamic, that kind of spirit. She really is innocent, anxious, and smart. And I think that's a really awesome combination for a human being to have.
You do that with such a tempo too, don't you? I mean, do you see it that way, that there's almost a metronome going in this book, and sets it up for the wonderful humor that comes almost in every page?
I take humor very, very seriously. I can't tell you how seriously I take it. People say, "Oh, it's just a joke. It's just shtick. It's being funny." No, humor is one of the highest levels of human achievements. I hate it when people, just think humor's, just this byproduct of a person trying to be witty. It's something great in and of its own right. It's wonderful. I always gravitate toward funny people and vice versa. And so for me, having that humor being placed on the page was utmost important.
As far as placing it on the page, does it come funny, or is it honed to be funny?
It comes funny. I mean, I just, when it comes to humor, I just let it flow through me. And then it goes on the page. I proof it, see what's up, see if it needs to be tweaked. And then we're off to the races. Yeah.
And you can enjoy that process, right? You can
I do
you can
enjoy that
enjoy
process.
that, yeah.
Yeah. And I know that things aren't working when there's not enough of that.
And do you feel that it can never take away from the gravity of the story?
No, no. Look, if you're writing about the human condition, that's not going to be a lot of fun, right? In terms of just the bare bones of it. The humor this is why I do think that humor is so important. It's just mastering how to put together the right ingredients to make what shouldn't be funny funny. Look, the Italians make great tripe. They don't start out with something that's necessarily delicious. The fourth stomach of a cow isn't delicious, but if you do the right things to it, it brings tears to your eyes. You're so happy eating it. And I want to do the same thing. And I apologize to my vegetarian readers, but I want to do the same thing with my prose.
And tripe is a funny word.
Tripe is a funny word too.
Yeah.
So there you go. Bingo. Mission accomplished.
The name of the new novel is Vera, or Faith. It is published by Random House. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week. And thanks for listening.